Well, welcome to Hope for Med.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Hope for Med podcast. I am your host, Dr. JB, and today's featured guest is Erin Fortner. She is a lawyer turned medical student and is currently completing her second year of medical school. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on your program, Dr. JB. It's such an honor to be able to come on to Hope for Med and contribute in whatever small way that I can.
And we are very happy to feature you today. So, Erin, let us start from the very beginning. Why a career in medicine? Just walk us through what happened.
So I started out pre-med in college and went to medical school after undergraduate at the University of Iowa and went into pharmaceutical products liability work for a while and then transitioned and was an SVU prosecutor in the Atlanta, Georgia area in Conyers for a while as well. And during that time, I came to some personal and professional revelations that for me, I felt like maybe I should have finished the pre-med path I was on initially. Maybe that was the path that was really the best path for myself and journey. And things had been happening at work as far as just burnout, both jobs, unhappiness, burnout, struggling in a lot of those ways. And then my dad actually had suffered a stroke. And that was a big wake-up call for me as far as thinking about what I really wanted to spend the rest of my life doing. And so I loved being an advocate for other people. I was a good lawyer. I was an effective lawyer. I loved actually helping others. But for me personally, and I did trial work, and I have plenty of friends in the law who love what they do. They're sticking with that profession. And then I have a ton of friends who actually also left the law for very similar reasons. So it was a process for me. I think for me, this whole career change has also accompanied life changes. And so it was definitely a process, not an event. And then medicine for me, because I started out as a pre-med in science, and I love science, I love learning, I love helping and advocating for other people. And I just really went back to that. The law that I was doing intertwined a lot with science anyways. The pharmaceutical product liability was a lot of heavy science and FDA regulatory stuff. And then even as a prosecutor, because I did SVU work, I was working a lot with expert physician witnesses. But yeah, I mean, medicine, I was drawn to it for the learning, for helping others, the science part of it. And for me, it felt like a very positive way to make an impact on the world. Mm-hmm. In law, and I guess in medicine too, when you're helping someone, whatever has occurred, maybe not all the time in medicine, sometimes I guess you can hopefully prophylactically prevent things, but in law, whatever terrible thing has happened is already over with. So it's always, this terrible thing has already happened, mm-hmm. and you do what you can to bring justice to that situation through the legal system. But as we all know, there are a lot of obstacles with that. And there's a lot of red tape, and the legal system went through a lot of changes in the last few years in general, the laws, regulations, and everything. So I reached a point for me where I felt like I could be a better advocate and have more effectiveness as a physician. And it felt positive to me in that way. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
Okay. And you said you did pharmaceutical law?
I did start out doing pharmaceutical product liability work. Yes. Okay.
And what exactly did that entail?
So that's where I worked on, I was hired out of law school to really work on FDA regulations for a case. And it was a multi-district litigation case. So it wasn't a class action, but it's similar. And so one of the founding partners at the firm I was hired to work at, he actually discovered these cases. He was a pharmacist, and they were the original firm that brought the suit, and then it expanded to other states and areas and other firms. And so ultimately, my job wrapped up when that got sent up to New Jersey they kind of combined that multi-district litigation, and that gets sorted out usually in New Jersey. That's a big state of incorporation for the pharmaceutical companies. So my job was to research and find and work on FDA regulations.
Okay.
And that everything went through a lot of changes with the Supreme Court back in 2010 with a case called Pleva v. Mensing. And so some things altered the law, and that definitely has changed the course of pharmaceutical product liability forever for right now.
How so?
In 2010, the Supreme Court, as I said, had a case called Pleva v. Mensing, and they ruled that you can no longer sue generic drug companies for state failure to warn claims. You can sue a brand name drug company if they failed to warn on their label under a state law. So if the company knew that drug X caused cancer and they hid that and they did not put that on their label, warning this drug can cause cancer, you are now preempted. You can no longer sue a generic drug for state failure to warn claims.
Wow.
And that's,
but they knew. So even if they knew that this drug could cause cancer and then they release it and it's a generic drug and it causes cancer and people die, you cannot sue them.
Right. That was my understanding and our interpretation of that regulation when I was working on the cases. And that was the point that they failed to warn, even knowing about that risk or having data or memos or internal documents that stated as such. So that kind of foreclosed that area of law for a lot of people. And so patients and even physicians don't realize when you prescribe and take a generic drug, if there is a state failure to warn claim situation, you've really forfeited your right to any kind of recourse. And it's very unfortunate. A lot of the brand name companies, which are still open to liability, as far as when I was working on these cases way back then, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know if the law has changed since then. So I can't speak to the necessarily the current state of things. I'm assuming it hasn't changed much, but the issue now is people just aren't aware of that. And people, for the most part, Medicare, Medicaid, insurance companies, of course, don't cover brand name drugs. Physicians have to specifically write that on a prescription pad or electronically now. And it's unfortunate because a lot of those brand name drug companies were the pioneering companies that invested in the product. So they are the ones that are now open to the full liability and also they're not exempted from the lawsuit. So I think that's a shame when the pioneering companies are the ones that are left completely without. They're definitely not protected liability-wise in any way, shape, or form. And they're the ones that have invested in it. So they're ultimately some of the ones that have gone under. And then the generic companies are pretty, have a great deal of legal immunity. And that was an issue that came up. The case that I worked on, one of them was Tylenol. And so this was back in the day when parents, especially with children, didn't know that a liquid anti-cough syrup had acetaminophen in it. And then it had a ton of other stuff that was adverse to like children's livers. And so this was before there were any warnings on Tylenol for adults, or especially the pediatric version. So parents would be doubling up on acetaminophen and didn't know it with over-the-counter medications.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow, that's crazy. That's just
yeah.
Wow.
And then I went in to do special victims unit prosecution work as an associate district attorney. Mm-hmm. And that was a great, rewarding position as far as advocating for people, but it was very intense work, 7 days a week. I was a county prosecutor. There was a lot of backlog of cases and they were all very heavy. Mm-hmm. I mean, I couldn't even have a window in my room. People had to knock and before they came into my office because just of the material and content I was viewing. So it was a very heavy job. And I know as yourself as a physician, sometimes the negative part of work, the sad part of work, it can affect you, it can get to you. Mm-hmm. I dealt with felony, mainly sexual crimes, but physical abuse against minors. Some elder abuse cases I took, and there were some animal abuse cases I took, but mainly it was felony level child abuse.
Okay. And so how long did you work as a lawyer actively?
I would say about 2.5 years. Mm-hmm. And then I did research my last year. I was sort of working for the firm. My last year, even though I was still a law student, I was doing a lot of research for them at the time, FDA regulatory stuff. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I love being an advocate, but I started to really think about what I wanted long-term. And law is for me, for the field I was in, the trial work part, It was very intense. It's very solitary. It was very negative because you're only dealing with negative things, negative outcomes. And there's also, of course, and not to say this isn't true in a lot of fields, but there are a lot of politics that play into things. And that was something that I struggled with. I struggled with that when a DA makes decisions to charge certain crimes and certain people and not others. And then you have ethical issues, even with the pharmaceutical product liability stuff. There's a lot of red tape, and there's a lot of ethical things that come up that I'm not sure that have answers that are satisfactory or resolution all the time in our system. So I just reached a point where, even as a prosecutor, there were frustrations for me that I had trouble overcoming and saying, oh, I can live with this and do this the rest of my career. And one of those things is, for me in Georgia, sometimes we'd get cases where child services would have already investigated, and then they would close the case prior to a prosecutor like myself being able to intervene or bring charges or do anything. So I think one of the final straws for me as far as leaving the law was when I was a prosecutor, and I had a 12-year-old victim. Her father was angry with her. Her mother had passed away of a terminal illness, and her father was angry with her because she had failed a math course at school. And so he strangled her. That evening, she went to school the next day, and thank goodness the school nurse recognized that the sclera of her eyes was solid red because of strangulation. And so that got reported, but Child Protective Services closed that case, and they basically just determined that the father just needed some anger management classes. She was not removed or really interviewed, or I don't think evaluated enough or properly, neither were her siblings. And so my hands were tied. And I just remember going home after, and I'd had a lot of other horrific, heavy cases, child serial rapists who were jumping around from state to state. I mean, a lot of things. But this really just, I think for me, I just had trouble sleeping that night and the whole week. And I thought, I can't protect her. It's out of my hands. And he could strangle her again, or she could end up dead. And that was something I really struggled with, that feeling of helplessness, and my hands were tied. And unfortunately, a lot of the SVU cases deal with a lot of circumstantial evidence that it's not uncommon to have those kinds of issues come up. So I just had a lot of evaluation of what I can and want to do with the rest of my career in life. And then my dad had a stroke, and I thought maybe for me it would be a more positive path. And I enjoy and love science, going back in that original direction that I was kind of bent toward to begin with.
Mm-hmm. After you pursued this career as a lawyer, and then you decided, you know what, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to completely change careers altogether and do one that focuses on medicine. How was that perceived by your friends and loved ones?
Well, I will say, I think that change, and I think for me, I guess what I can contribute and share to people is mostly about change. Mm-hmm. That for me, change is possible, change is hard, and change is a process, not an event. Mm-hmm. And those, I think, three principles hold true for not just the person, myself, experiencing it, but those around you. Mm-hmm. Those apply to everybody in your life that's intimately involved with you on a regular basis. And for me, at first, a lot of people said, you're crazy. They're like, what are you talking about? You're just burned out, or maybe you need a vacation or a break, or maybe you should think about getting out of trial work and doing another aspect of the law. And it was difficult because people's initial reaction was not thumbs up. It was, you have school debt. I had a house. In my first house, I used up my first federal loan. They give you you have that one-time home buyer's loan deal. And I had used that and purchased a house and had initially planned to be settled and have a long-term career in the Atlanta area. And it was very difficult, especially to say, I want to go back to medical school, because everyone knows that's a really super long path. And at that time I was already older and I didn't have the science prerequisites. So I was going to have to not just take the MCAT, but go back and do a post-bac program. So that entailed selling my house, moving, taking out more loans, forfeiting a career that I had given everything to work for. And I did. I mean, I worked hard. I was on law review and did trial advocacy, and I had really been very career focused. So it was hard, and there was grieving that went along with that decision for myself and others around me.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? What do you mean by there was grieving?
I think that I personally, and I think this is something, at least from a lot of my friends and colleagues also can relate to, I think that I struggled for a long time in separating what I did with who I am. Mm-hmm. And when you start to really change, and it's not like an intellectual exercise where you say, well, I know I'm me, I have more parts to me than my job. When you really think about, well, what if you woke up the next day and you weren't a doctor or a lawyer, whatever it is you do, a teacher, whatever your identity as a career or profession is, I think that's really hard. And then when you're faced with a situation where you're truly contemplating shedding that, there's a lot of, I think, grieving that goes on as far as letting go of that and recognizing that you're not what you do, that what you do is not your identity. And it's, I don't know, I think it's an experiential thing. You have to experience that. It's not just something you can talk about or intellectually think through. So that was, I think that awareness, this is not my phrase, of course, but there's that phrase, awareness, acceptance, and action. And I think the first thing is just to be aware of how you're feeling. Are you happy? Are you miserable? What's really going on? Do you need a small series of changes? Do you need to press small buttons like you're not getting enough sleep, you're not exercising, you need some counseling? Or do you need a big lever change? And sometimes it's not good to make a big career change. Sometimes it's good to do small things like, well, I'm not getting enough sleep, I'm not taking self-care time, I'm not eating well, I'm eating Twinkies all day, maybe try something healthier. But sometimes it is, I think you reach a point where it's like, I need to pull a big lever. And for me, I was at that point. And that, for me, I was depressed. I wasn't exercising. I wasn't getting enough sleep. I had no social life. I had no time with family. And I'm someone that I like to be active. One of my favorite things in life is cycling. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first thing that I did as a new attorney when I was working is I bought myself a bike at the local Trek store. And I was so proud of that bike and happy. And I put it in my garage, and that's where it stayed when I was practicing law. I had all these thoughts that, well, I'll cycle on the weekends or after work and all that. And I ended up just working 7 days a week. And the bike stayed in the garage. And when I was doing some self-reflection and really the thought of changing careers, just thinking about it is the first step. Like just thinking in the back of your mind, I'm unhappy, maybe something could be different. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So those kind of things started to occur for me. And then the initial response from family and friends was negative and discouraging, but I did reach out to some mentors of mine. I reached out to some lawyers and physicians and some other friends, just some counselors. And some of those individuals were very supportive and really talked to me from their standpoint about, they were older and they had a lot of advice and wisdom to give me as far as not just thinking about your career, but making decisions for your own life and well-being and happiness and self-care. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I ended up getting some encouragement from them. And then I started to read books. There's a book called, what's it called? It's called, I think, Life Beyond the Law or something like that. Mm-hmm. Life After Law, that's what it's called. And it's an attorney who changed careers, and she has all these like 20 or something vignettes of different people who left the law and why they left the law. Now, some of them are still using their JD, but some of them completely left. And I tracked down one of the individuals in those books. Mm-hmm. He's actually a therapist. He was a big corporate lawyer in New York. He became a therapist, and I called him and had an appointment with him and discussed with him my desire to leave. And he was super helpful. And he went through the same thing. He was making a lot of money. Mm-hmm. He was a younger attorney at the time, on the top of the world, traveling internationally at a very prestigious international law firm position. And he was more miserable than he'd ever been in his life. Mm-hmm. what people see from the exterior of you is also a shock for them. And sometimes they have to grieve about the fact that the image you've put out there, which is you're content, you're happy, things are great, is not always what you're experiencing internally.
That's absolutely correct.
And sometimes people are kind of mad about that because they like and are comfortable with that version of you. So
but again, it's not about them. It's about you.
Exactly. And that's another thing. I think a lot of times we do things for other people. And that's another whole topic of something else that I had to confront were, like I was saying, sometimes you need a big lever change in life, but sometimes you have to start, for me at least, working on little things. One thing that was eating away at my time for self-care and happiness was kind of codepending other people, always being a fixer, helping others, and never reserving time for myself. And I think that's something a lot of people in the medical field, because the field is a caring, serving profession, I think that's a trap a lot of us can get into. So that's, I mean, because we're always told, oh, well, it's selfish to focus on yourself. And if you only have a little bit of time and you spend it on yourself, I think some people kind of feel guilty about that. But they always say you're your first patient. And that's true. That's not selfish. That's a good, I think, rule of thumb to advocate for yourself some.
Yeah, I agree that you are patient number one. And patient number one is who oftentimes gets forgotten because you only see patient number one when you're looking in the mirror, but patient number two through infinity throughout the day. And so to take care of patient number one, you have to be very intentional and connected. And
like, how often do we really take our own temperature? For me, it's almost thinking like when you start to get sick, you're kind of not feeling well, but you don't take your temperature. You don't really, like, oh, you just blow it off. But then by the time you have 102-degree fever, you're just really down and out. And you feel like crap and you didn't catch that. So for me, I think realizing that by the time you're really burned out or you're really depressed or you're really overwhelmed in maybe a situation that you need to make a change for yourself, the fork in the road happened a long time ago. I mean, and you ignored things. We ignore our own signs and symptoms. And I think when we take our own temperature and we realize we're hungry, we're angry, we're lonely, we're tired, we're sad, those kind of things people ask themselves, we're fearful, we're resentful, those things are symptoms of an underlying problem. And I realized I was completely ignoring all of that for myself. And I think a lot of that training starts when we're young. It starts with this path of, even in high school, you've got to know what you want to do. And you have to do all these AP classes and you have to be top of your class, and the competitive aspect and the pushing down self-care to perform and to compete and to attain that aspect of your life, to the exclusion of, I'm not a machine. And I know you understand, being in medicine and a physician, that whole mentality that I'm not a machine. How many times do you tell patients, you're not a machine, you can't do this to your body, it will break down, but yet we don't stop and take our own temperature. We give our power away a lot, I think. That's another kind of concept. Was I realized that I did have the ability to make a change. That was a huge thing for me. I did feel stuck for a long time. I was like, well, what other law jobs can I seek out? Maybe I can do something else. But for me personally, it really was not a good fit for me, my long-term self in the law in general. So switching to another law job for me would have just been switching seats on the Titanic. And I think I took my power back. I realized that I didn't need to live my life sort of being a victim of my circumstance. I had the ability to change. And I think a lot of times when people, I think this happens a lot. Sometimes I feel like when we complain about things, it's okay. Like sometimes people need to vent and bond in that way. There's a quote that I looked up last night for today, and it was, the feeling of having shared in a common peril is one element in the powerful cement which binds us. So I think sometimes sharing, complaining, and negative things is a way people bond. And sometimes it's very true. Like if you don't have sufficient PPE at your work and sufficient support staff and sufficient supplies. But it's not really complaining about that when you're voicing it and you're frustrated and you're trying to advocate and expose that frustration. But on the flip side of that, and that happened in the law, my colleagues and I, would complain about stuff and, how exhausted we were and our hours and all this stuff. I will say for me, another turning point was I realized that at a certain point, incessant, obsessive ruminating, complaining, and negativity was a symptom of my being unhappy. And that was feeding into my feeling of powerlessness. Mm-hmm. And that became a toxic, negative thing that was keeping me there. And so then I started to ask myself, how are things working for you, Erin? How's that working for you? How long have I lived like this? And why am I choosing to live like this? So I think for me, I just realized becoming healthier was kind of a combination of self-care, but self-awareness. And a big part of that for me was cutting back on negative people in my life, people that were just always negative. Mm-hmm. So yeah, changing things to being positive, trying to build up a support team of positive family and friends has been huge in my life. And I still work on that every day.
I think one of the things that you said that was so amazing was when you said taking your power back. And so the question I have is, when did you lose that power?
I think you lose that power when you say to yourself that I'm not in control, that anything that makes me unhappy is someone else's fault, something else's fault. It's not my responsibility. For me personally, that kind of sounds like tough love, because I know a lot of my friends and colleagues and myself have legitimate complaints about a toxic work environment, a system that is struggling to make changes that we all know should happen. Those are legitimate things. But on a daily basis, the bottom line is we are responsible for our own happiness, healthiness, and self-care. And if Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, who was a Holocaust survivor, can find meaning and contentment and survival in a Holocaust camp, surely, I hate to say it to sound harsh, but we can do a little bit of tough love for ourselves and say, hey, we do have power to make changes. And that starts with your thinking, your thought process, and gratefulness. It's a change, I think, in your attitude. And there's a lot of parts to us as people. When we ignore our physical health, our mental health, our spiritual health, it affects the other parts. And so, I just really had to make a major change in being positive. And that comes with time. I mean, I was feeling down. A colleague of mine, I'll never forget, I was a prosecutor. He was a young guy, mm-hmm. had a wonderful wife. He was physically fit. He was a good looking young man. He had everything externally. People would say this guy had everything going for him. And I remember he told a couple of us at lunch one day that he was thinking about killing himself. He was so depressed with his job, with his work. And he ended up making a change the same time I did. He went to a happier, different job for him in the law. And then I ended up leaving practicing law. But we both kind of talked about that. And it shocked me even. I didn't even know. Here I am in my own kind of unhappiness situation. Mm-hmm. And I was not sharing that I was thinking about leaving at the time because it was my job. It was at work. I wasn't going to tell my coworkers, hey, I'm thinking about turning in a resignation letter. Yeah. But he shared that openly at lunch. And of course, we encouraged him to get counseling. That's another thing I think it's sad to me that a lot of professionals don't feel like they can get counseling because they're so afraid it'll be on their record and it will negatively affect their career. So they don't seek help. But I do think that counseling, therapy, if people need AA or Al-Anon, I think those resources, there should be no hesitation for people to get help. But, and I hope he did. I think he might have. We did encourage him to go see a counselor. But yeah, he ended up making a change too. But we weren't sharing that with each other. So that's another thing. I think communicating and finding people you can share in a positive way that you're trying to make a change and having support from others.
And so, Erin, you've had such an amazing experience, life-altering experience working in the law. And then you transitioned and you started from the very beginning, post-baccalaureate,
There were a lot of tears. I cried many nights.
Yeah.
There was tears. And I feel so, I should have said this earlier. I do feel it's super cool and such a privilege to be having this interview on Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the quotes that I'll have to read it because I didn't want to mess it up. But one of the quotes that he said that I have actually referred to before in my life and today reflect on, he said that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no denying that change is possible, but it's also hard. I think the biggest obstacles that I overcame with that for me personally were overcoming fear
Mm-hmm.
and adapting to my new life. It's really hard to be getting a great paycheck and have a house, and then go to that to going back to being a student, living in a little studio apartment and not having that anymore. You kind of get derailed a little bit on my journey with some of the quote normal chronological timeline things. Like a lot of my fellow people in law school, my colleagues, they were at that point getting married or having children or situating in a more settled way. And I was going back to being a student again.
Mm-hmm.
And they were taking vacations that they'd worked hard for, and I couldn't because I was putting my savings into going back to school. So that was hard. But again, that's about long-term, not just short-term goals. And the journey is the destination. So you can choose to be happy and positive in the situation you're in on a daily basis and adapt to that. And I shifted, I think, from fear and living in the problem, being stuck in the problem, to living in the answer. And that's never static. Like, people think you're miserable. Well, I hate to tell people, I mean, I can tell them from my own experience, that misery doesn't stay static.
Mm-hmm.
It gets worse. You deteriorate.
Yeah, mm-hmm. That's right.
People are like, oh, well, I can tough it out till retirement. I can tough it out for just a few more years, 5 more years. I don't know. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But that's the same thing for being positive. You get up every day, it's not that it's not a struggle, but I think that's a key thing, overcoming fear. And that fear was, a lot of the fear we have is, I think, mental. It's projected, right? It's not even real. I remember shadowing this attorney who actually later became a federal judge. And she would always tell people, she was a mediator for a long time. And she was really good at her job. And I would shadow her and I would watch her mediate between 2 parties that were having a dispute. And her goal was to get them to settle, to come to a fiscal number that they would both be okay with and not go to trial, because then one of the parties was going to definitely lose. So it was kind of, a negotiation. And I remember one time she was frustrated because we'd been there for hours and one of the parties was just not being reasonable. And she finally looked at them and said, look, this is a real offer on the table. This is not monopoly money. You're fantasizing about what you think you can get in theory, and that may or may not happen. This is actual money on the table today. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, that really stuck with me. And I referenced that for myself many times. When you think about anything, a positive thing or negative thing, think about tangibly what's really an option for you. And people think that staying in a miserable, depressed, unhappy situation is an option. And I really have to encourage them to ask themselves, how's that working for you? Is it really an option if you work yourself to death and end up having a heart attack or a stroke or diabetes, or you're depressed and miserable and your relationships fall apart? Is it really an option? I mean, people tell themselves this is an option, but I think a lot of times what they don't see as an option is an option, which is you can change jobs, you can change careers. There are solutions. You can make little daily changes, maybe not a big lever change. And then they see things that aren't really options as options. I'm like, but is that really an option?
What do you mean by the ones that are not really options as options, like staying in and being miserable?
Yeah.
Forever?
Yeah. I mean, if you're depressed to a certain point where you're suicidal, or you're having drug and alcohol problems, or your relationships are not stable and they're falling apart because you're not caring for yourself or have the energy to attend to those. If your physical health is just declining, and as tasty as they are, if you're eating Twinkies and ice cream all day, if you're having all these signs and symptoms, which are not going to stay static. You're going to deteriorate in that direction if something doesn't happen. I personally don't think staying in a job like that is truly an option. Then I think that's when people have to say, it's not working for me, I've got to do something. And people say to themselves, well, I can't because I have all this debt. I can't because I'm too old. I can't because I have to pay my bills. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes we can't make an immediate big lever change. It is a process. Sometimes we have to set things up and get things in order. But I'm here to say it is possible because I've done it. Not that my situation is identical to other people, but it can be done. It may have to be done piecemeal, but it can be done.
And it's not easy, right? It's not easy. It's challenging. But if you are living true to yourself, then it's worth it.
Yeah, and I think COVID has brought this to the forefront for people more than ever. I mean, we've seen so many people and heard news reports and statistics on how many people are actually changing careers and quitting their miserable situations. I think that has been a positive outcome in some ways. The COVID crisis and pandemic has really forced people to reevaluate, I think, because it's really pushed people to the limit. I mean, it really is, because of things have gotten even worse at work and stuff. The situation has really put a lot of pressure on people, and it's really brought a lot of things to the forefront to where some of those same people are like, I can't take it anymore. I've reached bottom. And sometimes people have to reach bottom before they're ready to make a change, before they're in enough pain to say, I can't and won't live like this anymore.
So along those lines, now that you've made that transition and you are no longer actively practicing as a lawyer, and now you are in medical school, how are you applying those life lessons that you learned while being a lawyer, getting burnt out as a lawyer? What are you doing in medical school to prevent that from recurring?
Well, I think one thing is, I don't deny the fact that burnout is going to happen. And I even in medical school, a lot of times, I think the tendency is to tell us as students, well, you may not be one of those people that experience burnout. I don't know if that's fair to say. I think most people in the medical profession, whether you're a physician or a nurse or a PA or an MP or a CRNA or whatever your role is, I think most people would probably say in a survey they have felt burnout at some point or another. I mean, so that's just the nature of some of the work. But so first of all, I don't live in delusion about that. I'm very much in reality about the fact that burnout's going to happen. So I prepare for that. So I think concrete things that I do now, first of all, when I was in law school, I was so fixated on my career. I didn't work out as much. I did not take care of my physical health really much. I really just pursued my career. Like, I was just really focused on that aspect of my life alone. So now I really take care of myself physically, my cycle. I love that. I've not neglected that. And I'm reasonable about it. It's not all or none. I got off track a little bit the last few months. We had a lot of tests, and my dad actually had an emergency open heart surgery before Thanksgiving. So I missed a week of school, and it got me behind, and it was really stressful. And so I got off track with my exercise. And so I wanted to get back on track coming back the new semester. And one thing I've had to work on is not having an all or none attitude. So just doing little things. And my primary care physician, who, she probably doesn't even know this, but over the years, and I've seen her for probably 15 years or more now. And she's a cyclist. She's does take care of herself. And she said to me at my appointment in December, she was like, why don't you just do four times a week for an hour? You don't have to do more than that. And that was really helpful and supportive to hear. So I try to do what I can. So I am cycling, but I'm not like all or none. And prioritizing the physical activity has been important, because for me, it helps get rid of my stress in a big way. It really helps me in that sense. I take care of my spiritual self. When I start my days now, I listen to positive things. I've been listening lately to Nim's Purja. There's a documentary on Netflix called 14 Peaks, and his book is called Project Possible. And his story is so inspiring and motivating. So when I walk my dogs in the morning, or I'm doing mundane things like brushing my teeth or doing dishes. I don't have time right now to read a book that's not related to my schoolwork, or driving. I put the Audible book on and I listen to positive, inspiring, motivating stories. Or listen to other people you've interviewed on Hope for Med. I listen to positive podcasts like that. Things like that help me start my whole day positively. Having a schedule has helped, to be honest. For me, when I don't have a schedule and I'm not a little bit more regimented, I get off track. And I get off track. When we get off track with things we have to do, then we get off track with self-care time because we sacrifice it. I've prioritized family more this year than ever. I'm not a part of as many clubs. When I was in law school, I was a teaching assistant. I was on the Project for Innocence. I did law review. I did so many extra things. And it's not that I didn't enjoy them. It's not that they weren't productive and good things, but I had no time for myself or others. So I'm prioritizing, obviously with my dad being ill, and my sister and brother-in-law just adopted their son, which is awesome. I became an aunt, and so I have a nephew now.
Congratulations.
And so thank you. Yeah, so I've prioritized, instead of staying and studying on maybe a break, I work hard where I can take that true break and go home and see them. I make time on Sunday mornings to call family. So I call, my grandfather's almost 90 years old, and I just take 10 minutes on Sunday mornings to call him and check in. I've prioritized myself, but in doing that, I've prioritized other people I care about and love as well. And they've enjoyed that. My grandfather didn't hear from me in law school. And I know I made sure that my sole focus and purpose on a daily basis isn't just to get the A or just to boost my resume. And that's not, at the end of the day, a job doesn't love you back. And one time the same primary care physician, and I have to speak to that, having mentors has been really important for me. Having people in my life that are physically, mentally, and spiritually healthy themselves and are working on that has been super important for me. And a lot of people that have influenced me probably don't even know it. Like, as an example, I don't even know if my primary care, I won't share her name because I don't know that she'd appreciate that on the air, but I don't know that she's even realized how much of a positive influence she's had on my career path and also my self-care with the cycling and all that. And one time she said to me in an appointment there's a lot to, basically her gist was, there's a lot to see and do and enjoy in life. And when she said that to me, I realized that's true. There's so many things. And we think, oh, I'll put that on my bucket list. I'll take that trip to whatever place you want to see or do, once I'm retired or in 10 years. And you, more than anyone as a physician, Dr. JB, you know that especially the work you do, that may or may not come for someone.
That's right.
I mean, that as I've gotten older, my perspective, I just turned 35, so I don't care to share that. But yeah, I mean, hitting my mid 30s, it does make you realize more and more that you're not immortal. And 5 or 10 years, we assume that we're going to have that time. But with my dad having a stroke at a younger age and then the open heart surgery, you realize, well, every day is a blessing and we're not guaranteed tomorrow.
So without being guaranteed tomorrow, it's extremely important for you to take your power back and realize that you as an individual have more power in your current situation than you realize.
Yeah. And the other thing, and it's also, it's not just surrounding yourself with positive people, but it's putting boundaries down and or eliminating negative toxicity at the same time. And I think that's really important, taking a self-inventory, really figuring out things like that. Because I do, and this sounds cliche, but I do believe that we manifest what we put our energy and time into. And one of the, he's a Buddhist monk, and I really like him and listen to a lot of his stuff. Dan Dapani is his name. And he had a TED Talk on energy and how our energy is finite and it is limited. And he was talking about that in the sense of our daily energy and our life energy, because our lives are finite and they are limited. And he talked about how you have to assess what you want to put your energy into on a daily basis as if it was your money in your bank account. We literally, a lot of, especially if you've been through a lot of school and you have debt, there, at least for me, there's a frugal mindset, like careful about what I spend and how I spend it. And sometimes I strain over spending a little bit of extra money for something. But what if we treated our energy like that? Was his point. It's finite, it's limited. Do you want to put your energy into a negative source or someone that's sucking your energy? He calls them energy vampires. And so his encouragement was, if you have friends or family that are going through a hard time and they need more from you, that's okay to be there for them. But if you find that in your life you have people that are constantly negative, they're constantly sucking your time and energy, it's a one-way street, it's constant rumination, obsession in a negative way, then that's when you evaluate, maybe I need to put boundaries down with those individuals or back off to protect your own self. So I did a lot of cleaning house. And people don't like that, because when you start to make changes, they're uncomfortable with that new version of you, because the old version of you is serving them in some way in the relationship. So that's just something people have to work through, being okay with them being uncomfortable with the new you. And that's where you have to say, that's their problem, not mine. I'm taking care of my side of the street.
So to kind of summarize everything that you've been saying, it really all just comes down to really being intentional, right? Intentional with clearing out negativity from your life, intentional with prioritizing yourself, but intentional with doing that self-inventory survey and really seeing how happy am I with my current life's decisions. And if you find that you're unhappy, intentional about making the change and realizing that it really is your life, not anybody else's. It's yours, right?
Yes.
And knowing that sometimes many decisions that you make in life are not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. You're going to have to persevere in it. There's going to be some sacrifices that you make along the way. But if you are living true to yourself, and if you're staying connected with yourself, then it's worth it. 100%.
And we have to shed, that's exactly right. And we have to shed things in that process. Fear and ego is a big thing. You can't save yourself and your pride sometimes at the same time. And so, really digging deep and reflecting and all that. And definitely, another thing I'll just quickly say as we wrap up is that I did reach out to other people. You're not an island, and suffering in silence, not going to a counseling appointment if you need to, or a career coach, or talking to friends and colleagues. And I really sought out other lawyers and physicians who were well into their career. Some of them were in the middle of it, or some of them were closing to retirement. And so I really kind of interviewed them on their thoughts on things and what I was thinking. And it was so helpful. And they were honest. They didn't hold back about the pros and cons. And then I sat down and made a list and thought about really what path I wanted. And so I think reaching out to others, and what can it hurt? If you explore the idea of leaving a situation or a job or a career change, it's just a thought. You're just having a conversation. You don't have to follow through with it. So it could be helpful to do that exercise, even if you decide not to make that come to fruition.
Erin, this has been fantastic. Our time has gone by so quickly, and you've given so many wonderful words of wisdom already. And these final few minutes that we have left together, do you have any other words of wisdom or encouragement that you would want to share with anyone who may be thinking about making a transition in their lives?
I would just reiterate that change is possible, even when you think it's not. It may cost you something, but for me, change was worth it. And when you take control of your attitude about things and you take control of your situation, that's when change becomes possible. And then I would just say, like I said, it's hard, but overcoming anything that's in your way, like fear, adapting to that, pulling on that inner resiliency, again, for me, it was worth it. And then just be gentle with yourself. Change, again, is a process. It's not an event. So sometimes we need to push little buttons Sometimes we need to make a big lever change, but it's trial and error. We're not perfect. So the main thing is just to keep moving forward in a positive direction. And I'm so honored and privileged to have been invited, and hopefully what I shared will help someone else out there.
Yeah. Who says a doc can't rap? DOCTORJB. The greatest doctor to ever touch the mic. The greatest podcast ever broadcasted or pre-recorded. Come learn some. Each one teach one. I'm done.